Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new video. Today I'm going to show you how to replace the crank sensor on your Carrera e-bike. All of the bikes that this is going to work on is going to include the brand new Carrera Vengeance E, which is the bike that I have here, the Carrera Vengeance E 2.0. It's also going to include all of the old Carrera bikes that have this sensor type, which include the Subway E, the Crossfire E, the Vengeance E, and the Vulcan E's. The sensor doesn't necessarily have to be in this location here for this to work for you. It can also be at the bottom of the crank down here, which I'll show on a little video that I'll pop on the screen now. So let's jump over to the bench and I'll show you the different sensor types, which sensor you're going to need for your bike and the tools needed. Okay, so I just wanted to pop this little clip in here just about compatibility of the sensors. Now the only difference between the new style sensor and the old style sensor is the connector that goes into the ECU. There are two different types which I'll pop on screen now. The easiest way to know what sensor you need is by taking the connector out and matching it up with the one you're buying. If you do that, you pretty much can't go wrong. So there's two different types. You've got WSUC SSC and WSUC-SSC21. I'll put the codes for these sensors on the screen now. These are the part numbers that across the industry are used to identify which sensor you need. Okay, so I'm going to show you two different ways of how to actually replace the sensor. The first way is going to include us just taking the sensor off with the crank on the bike. The second way I'm going to show you is actually taking the crankset off and separating it away from the bike so that we can work on the crankset and the sensor away from the actual bike. So for example, here we've got a crankset. This is a broken sensor here off the bike now, and then I'll show you how to do it that way as well. I'll be going through the video showing you all the different points of detail in terms of how we're going to take the sensor off, and we're going to troubleshoot every single different part. So these are the tools we're going to need for method one. So method one is going to include a screwdriver, something to cut the zip tie for the cables, a pick so that we can disconnect the sensor, and also some zip ties that we can re-zip tie the new sensor back into place. Now, if we're looking at method two, where we take the crank off, we're also going to need a crank extractor. This here is just a basic bike cut crank extractor, and also if we need to take the electrical control unit out due to the sensor cable not coming out properly, then we're also going to need a 3mm Allen key as well. You don't have to have dedicated tools for all of this. You can have, for example, a multi-tool with a screwdriver and Allen keys in it, and a set of scissors will work. I've just got the dedicated tools here to make it easier for demonstration purposes. So we know that the sensor is going to be broken if we see an error 21 or 22, or if the sensor is snapped in any way. For example, this one here, we've got the cable which is snapped. If you have a look at some other sensors, which I'll put on the screen now, it could also be snapped in many other ways as well. If you're having cutting out issues, if we're having any issues in terms of no power to the bike, it can come from the crank sensor being snapped. So let's go back over to the bike now, and I'll show you the first way of how to remove and replace your crank sensor. Okay, so I've put my camera here so that I can hopefully show you how to replace the sensor from this angle here. The first thing that we want to do is actually cut the zip tie, which is going to be down underneath here. I'll put a video on the screen. I've put a yellow zip tie here so that it's easier to identify. Be really careful when cutting this zip tie because you could cut through and damage some of the wires under here. So the first thing we want to do is just cut this zip tie. Okay, so we've cut that zip tie. The next thing we want to do is get our screwdriver and actually remove the 3 bolts on the back here holding the sensor in place. So that's 2 on this side here and 1 on the far side here. Okay, so once we've got these 3 bolts loose, we should just be able to remove the sensor away from the bike. The cover should come off first, like that. This is a separate part of the sensor. We can take this away and actually place it away here, and then the sensor should pop out from the top and just lift away like that. We can let it dangle here now loosely at the bottom of the bike, and then I'm going to switch the camera angle so I can show you now how to fully remove it and disconnect it from the bike. Okay, so I've just changed the angle here, and now that we can see that the sensor is dangling freely, what we want to do is just pull the connector loose here. It should be a white connector like this that comes out, and then there'll be a tab on this side over here, which you can see on the camera. We just want to push that in, and then the sensor will disconnect. And there we are. Now, if the connector didn't pull out of the bike like it should have, and like I showed here, skip to the timestamp that I'm just showing down below now. Basically, this is going to take you to a point in the video where I show you how to remove the electrical control unit, that's the ECU, that's in this box up here, to actually get access to the connector, because sometimes it doesn't come out like I've shown here, or in some cases the connector might actually be broken at this point here, meaning that you might pull the sensor out and it might come out without the connector actually coming back out. So let's show you how to pop the sensor back onto the bike now. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is actually reconnect the sensor at this point here. So what I'll do is I'll just reconnect it. You want to make sure that this connection is really nice and tight and secure, and then we can leave this like this here, just dangling freely. We'll push it back up inside the bike once we've got the sensor properly mounted. Okay, so now we have our sensor dangling freely. What we want to do is just get the sensor. You can route it either the cable around this way or the front way. What I'm going to do is actually route it around the front here, and then we should just be able to slot it in to the port here, which I'm going to do now. It's a little bit awkward with the camera in the way, so I'm just going to slot that in now. Okay, so now that we've got the sensor fully seated here, what I've done is I've taken 2 of the screws out of the cover, and I've just got the 1 screw here now to make it a little bit easier. All we need to do is reverse of what we did before, screw all 3 screws into the casing of the sensor here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do it one by one. I'm not going to have all 3 screws in the casing because they do have a tendency to fall out here. So what I'm going to do is just screw this in quickly, exactly the same as we unscrewed it. The one thing to note is be really careful with these screws. They are small and quite fragile, so make sure that the screwdriver you're using is fully seated into the screw and that we're not cross-threading the screw into the hole. If you're not sure, or you can't reach the screws properly, or you're not sure that you're going to be able to get the screws in properly with the crank actually on the bike, skip to the stamp that I've put again on the screen now, and it'll show you the second way to actually replace the sensor by taking the crank off. Okay, so now that we've screwed the sensor in, now we've just got to reroute the wire properly, get the access wire into the ECU casing at the bottom of the bike, and re-zip tie all the cables together, which I'm going to show you how to do now. Okay, so now all we're going to do is just push the connector and the excess cable back up into the hole here and re-zip tie all the cables together. Okay, so that's basically the first method, how to replace your crank sensor on a Carrera Vengeance E. If that's worked for you, then brilliant. I'll see you in the next video of how to fix your Carrera Vengeance. If it hasn't, then we're going to go now into the second way of how to replace your crank sensor on the Carrera Vengeance E or other Carrera bikes by taking the chain set off. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to replace the sensor by taking the crankset off. The first thing that you want to do is repeating the steps that I showed you earlier by actually disconnecting the sensor from the ECU. I'll pop a clip on the screen of me doing that again now. After we've disconnected all the cables from the sensor, the first thing we want to remove this bolt with an 8mm Allen key. I forgot to actually put that in at the start of the video, but I'd have probably put it at the bottom somewhere. I've got an 8mm Allen key here, so I'm just going to remove that bolt now. Okay, so once you have that bolt removed, you want to get your crank extractor and actually make sure that it's wound out and that the threads on the crank extractor are flush with the metal plate here. And then what we want to do is use the crank extractor to actually pull the crank off. So all we need to do is actually screw it into the threads here on the chain set and then turn this handle here to pull the chain set away from the bike. I'm going to show you how to do that now. Now, some people may actually use a 22mm spanner to tighten this on further. I find that just getting it hand tight is enough for this to be in there properly. I wouldn't use a spanner to put it in. First of all, I would use your hands just to thread it in firstly. That means that you won't cross thread it and won't damage the chain set. Now we're just going to remove the chain set by spinning this here. What'll happen is it'll spin nice and loosely and then it'll get really tight and more difficult to pull the chain set away from the bike. And now the chain set should just pull away from the bike and then we can remove the chain. And there's our chain set. Let's hop over to the bench now and we'll remove the sensor from the chain set and put your brand new sensor on. Okay, so now we're at the bench. This sensor should actually spin free on the chain set. We're going to do the same thing as we did before. Remove these bolts here. And now we've got all of those bolts removed, the sensor should just pull away from your chain set and be completely free there. Then we want to get our brand new sensor, which I'm going to be using the same one that I had before just because it's a perfectly working sensor that I have. And then screw in all 3 of these bolts. Brilliant, so now we've got our sensor back on the chain set. Let's go back over to the bike and reinstall this chain set. Just worth noting quickly that you don't need to take the pedal off at any point. I've just kept it sort of like this on my bench here. The pedal doesn't need to come off. Okay, so now we're just going to put our chain set back on the bike, making sure that it's the opposite direction of the other crank arm and that the sensor lines up with the little stop here for the sensor as well. And now we can just screw in this bolt here back into the chain set. This should be 40 Newton meters, or if you don't have a torque wrench, just put it, just screw it in and make sure that it's very, very tight. And then we just want to reconnect the sensor as shown in the previous clips. Okay, so if the sensor doesn't actually, the sensor connector doesn't actually come out of the hole at the bottom here, what we're going to want to do is actually remove the ECU, which I'm going to show you how to do now. The first thing that we want to do is remove the 4 bolts on the bottom here. We don't have to worry about these 2 bolts in the middle. They actually just hold the ECU onto the ECU plate. So let's go ahead and remove the ECU. Okay, so once we have the ECU removed, we can just disconnect the crank sensor and pull it through the hole in the bottom. I'll show you how to do that now. And then to reconnect it, we just want to push the cable back through the hole and then just reconnect it with the ECU. And then to put the ECU back in the bike, it's just a case of shoving all the wires together and pretty much just shoving it all back up into the bike and putting all 4 bolts back in. I'll show you how to do that now. It can be a bit fiddly. Alright, so it's worth just noting when you put an ECU in, it's worth only tightening the bolts a little bit at a time, as you saw me doing. So pretty much just tightening the one bolt in, a few threads, then getting the next one in and the next one in, because as you can see, the ECU a lot of times doesn't like to position itself tidily into the bike. So by doing that, it means that you've got a little bit more freedom in terms of moving the ECU while one of the bolts is in to locate the other bolts as well. So that's how we take the ECU out of the bike, just in case the connector of the sensor doesn't come out of the actual bike. Alright, so that's how you replace the sensor on your Carrera Vengeance E. I hope that this video has gone over everything that you need to know about replacing the sensor on the Carrera Vengeance E and other Carrera e-bikes, I should say. If you have got any other electrical issues with your bike, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below, or you could go and watch my other video, which should be linked at the end screen now, on how to diagnose and fix the electrical issue with your Suntour Carrera bike. I've also got a whole video series documenting how to replace the ECU. I've got a video on how to replace the display, and also how to diagnose battery issues and replace the battery cradle as well. If you've got any of those issues, go and have a look at those other videos. Again, if you've got any questions, just leave them in the comments, and thank you very much for watching.